So today we're going through lecture 1, information system security. So the basic concepts that we're going to talk about in this first lecture, trying to give you the basic information that you're going to need to go through this course and get the knowledge and the competencies that are required to enable you to operate in a IT environment, understanding what are the main IT security concerns, information security concerns, cybersecurity concerns that we need to deal with in a modern corporate setting where we depend so much on using information technology as a tool to help us to achieve a competitive advantage. But of course, being BTM majors taking this course, the basic concepts of and the role of management information systems, information technology, information systems, and more precisely business technology in a corporate setting is something that by now you'll be very, very familiar with. So an important thing that we need to start with is keeping in mind that we're not operating in a vacuum. We are working in a connected world, what we refer to as the cyberspace. So the networked environment on a global scale, where we're going to have all kinds of potential stakeholders, where we're going to have all kinds of different businesses and customers that are connecting through the internet on a global scale. And so that is the landscape that we have to deal with now. As well, in that globalized landscape, as well as having legitimate users, we have some ill-intentioned users or potential individuals who may want to take advantage of this fact that businesses, governments, corporations, commerce, business, banks are all connecting to this global network. And they may use that for illicit gains. They may use that to do money laundering. They may use that as a tool to assist them in the commission of crimes. And so one of our roles as BTM professionals is going to be to try to make that as difficult as possible for them. So that's sort of this global, cyberspace that we're looking at. And it's referred to here, we can think of it as the new frontier or the final frontier, or in a certain way, the Wild West of previous centuries. That's the Wild West today. The potential cyber criminals who are taking advantage of cyberspace to commit cyber crimes, right? So that's perhaps new vocabulary, new words that we need to start to get used to. They see themselves as, in many cases, as committing victimless crimes, which isn't really true because there's always going to be a cost. There's always going to be a victim. The corporation first that's being attacked, or the government organization that is being attacked, or the hospital that is being attacked is a victim, which is then going to have an effect on the legitimate users or the customers or society in general, because this is creating additional costs, and this is causing additional problems that are definitely going to impact the role of the organization and the benefits of the organization. So definitely going to affect the cost of services and products that are being sold. Another thing also, we have a fiduciary responsibility as a member of an organization to protect the assets and the data that is entrusted to us. The data of our users, the data of our customers, in some cases private data. We have contractual obligations that require us to have certain information security or cybersecurity measures in place. We have legal obligations. There's all kinds of laws out there. We can think of privacy laws or healthcare data protection laws or other similar type of laws that require us to implement cybersecurity. We have obligations because of international treaties. We have obligations because of certain services that we use. So if we're dealing with money, if we're dealing with credit cards, this gives us some obligations as well for cybersecurity. So it's really the responsibility of the organization, and of course, our responsibility as members of the organization to implement cybersecurity. We also find ourselves in a world of connected objects more and more, often referred to as the Internet of Things. So basically, pretty much every device today has some kind of connectivity, be it networked, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, infrared, all kinds of ways that the different things that we use in our daily lives, in our homes, in our businesses, are connecting to the outside world. All of these objects are creating a lot of data, generating a lot of data. Some of the data is pretty sensitive, geolocalization data, for example, generated by your phone, may be misused. That's an easy example. But, not all of it is necessarily bad, but we do need to keep in mind that, this could be this could be of interest to certain criminal elements who want to misuse this information, perhaps to help them to commit a crime, perhaps to harass or commit crimes against the individuals, but also financial crimes or frauds that may be facilitated by the misuse of this data that is made available or created or generated by these connected objects of the Internet of Things, IoT. So that's sort of the landscape, the reality of what we're talking about, and that is creating all these issues that we need to be able to deal with. So a couple of little things just to be clear of what it is that we're talking about. So we are talking about information system security from a global point of view. So it's important that we understand that, what security is. And so we can first see security as, sort of the official technical definition of security as the absence of unacceptable risks. And so there's a lot of elements of that are really have to do with more with perception and feeling than with reality. So what is acceptable to one person may be unacceptable to another. What is acceptable to an organization may be unacceptable to another. It really depends on the circumstances. It really depends on the situation. And so there's a big element of that relates to perception. Also, when we talk about the absence of unacceptable risks, we need to keep in mind that the absence may be real, but it may be just perceived absence. So what I mean by that is that, there could be risk, we just don't know about it. And so we got to be prepared for these kinds of situations. We got to put in place mechanisms. Do keep in mind, this course is being done in a university undergraduate context where we're trying to train you to become future managers. And so we wanted to go at this in a scientific way, as much as possible. We don't want to. We're not artists who are trying to be lucky and perhaps do a decent job and to what we have to do to protect our organizations. We want to be scientific, smart, professional managers. And so we want to know what are the best ways, what should we do to be a diligent and responsible manager. So this notion of absence is important for us because, maybe it's just because we don't know about it. But because we don't know about it doesn't mean that it's there. In the same way, in this idea of perception, maybe there is risks, but we're under-evaluating or over-evaluating this risk. And so if we're under-evaluating, maybe we're not doing enough to prepare ourselves for the risk, for the situation. Or maybe we're over-evaluating it, which means we're spending too much money and too much resources trying to protect ourselves from something that isn't really that big of a problem. So we really want to give ourselves mechanisms because there's a whole bunch of biases that we're faced with as managers, as individuals, that may affect what we see and what we don't see and how important it is compared to how it really is, and etc. So do keep that in mind. And what we're going to be talking about has to do with this object that we define as security, and that there's a lot of subjectivity associated with that. And as scientific managers, objectivity is our goal. Subjectivity is not our friend. Another thing also I want you to keep in mind is risk. What is risk exactly? Because we said security is the absence of unacceptable risk. So this, necessarily any definition of security connects it to risks. So really a key issue is, okay, what is this thing that we call risk? So we're really going to use a model to keep in mind what risk is. And really the best one out there is Crichton's risk triangle. So that defines risk as related to three components. Potential hazard, so something that might hurt us. The hazard, which is defined by Crichton, the hazard is also we all often refer to it as a threat. So a threat is a form of hazard. A vulnerability or some kind of weakness that the system is faced with, and then the exposure we have to that risk. So the exposure, often we can think of it as a financial exposure, so a loss of money, but some kind of loss, something that we like or that we need or that we have as a goal that is going to be affected negatively from a situation. That's the exposure that we have. And so for risk to exist, and that's what this triangle here is showing us, for risk to exist, all of those three elements have to be concurrently have to exist. So there has to be a potential threat that can take advantage of a weakness. And when it does take advantage of this weakness, the result is that our exposure to risk materializes. So imagine that I have a situation where there's a hacker there who wants to come into my network, and I have a bug in one of my softwares or in one of my equipments that allows him to take advantage of, so he can actually get in. And once the hacker gets in, he steals money, and so that's my exposure. So if those three elements concurrently exist, then I have a potential risk situation. So that's something that we're going to be talking about, that we're going to be thinking about, because we as IT professionals, we're going to try to, as much as possible, to identify what are these potential situations where hazards, vulnerability, and exposure coexist. And if we can envision it, we're going to try to make sure that we have some kind of mechanism in place to try to make that really very, very unlikely. We're not going to 100% stop it, but we're going to try to make it hard. We don't, it's like the guy who's running in the forest with his friend who run into a bear. You don't have to be faster than the bear. You have to be faster than the other guy, so he's the one who gets caught by the bear. So that's pretty much the same thing. There's hackers out there. There's people whose business it is to intrude networks and to make a living trying to take advantage of weaknesses. So we just want to be much better protected than the other people out there, so that they'll get hacked and not us. Because if a hacker really, really wants to get into your network, he's gonna somehow figure out some kind of way. But that's, maybe I'm a little bit ahead of myself here, because we'll be talking a lot more about those things over the next 13 weeks. So that's our two key definitions. Do keep that in mind: what security is and what risk is. And so again, risk is defined for us as the likelihood that something bad can happen to an asset, or something that has value to us, the asset, and there's the potential for something to go wrong, right? So that's the definition of risk that we're going to be using. Now, do keep in mind that sometimes things won't go bad. Things will end up better than we had expected. That's referred to as an opportunity. We're trying to get opportunities. We're trying to take advantage of market situations, whatever. And sometimes it'll go bad. So when we're talking about risk, is always this idea in the back of our head that there's a potential for something to go bad. Then there's the threats, I refer to as hazards in the model, the Crichton's model. So threats is anything that could take advantage of the asset, that could damage the asset. Common threats, things like viruses, things like hackers, things like employees who are mischievous, who want to cause damage, or who are just incompetent, and potentially these can all be defined as threats. And then there's the other element, which is the vulnerability, so the weakness, right? And there's a lot of weaknesses out there that threats can take advantage of. Some of them are just bugs. Some of them are because of the nature of the different technologies or tools or things that we're using. For example, one vulnerability that we have is people. People can be convinced to do something bad, either in exchange for money or some kind of benefit. They could see a reason why they may want to do something bad. They may be able to rationalize a reason that it'd be acceptable. So potentially people can be a vulnerability. Now, of course, we have legitimate users as well, and also we need users. If you remember from your previous BTM courses or classes where they talked about the components of an information system being hardware, software, data, people, and business processes, all of those have certain number of vulnerabilities that can affect them. So I talked about people, users in particular. But technology can have flaws. Connected technology can open up doors. Software can have bugs. Software could be purposefully designed with bugs or so-called backdoors, so somebody could get into that system. There are all kinds of potential vulnerabilities that we need to think about. And one of the things that we're going to be doing in this course is looking at some tools that we can use that can perhaps help us to identify some vulnerabilities. Another thing that we're going to be doing in this course is thinking about potential threats, perhaps by using scenario modeling or threat modeling or attack modeling to try to identify potential threats based on historical information that we have, based on our experience, based on what's happened to other companies like ours, based on Market Watch, looking out there at what's happening in the industry, using going to databases or user groups or organizations that track these kinds of things, potential threats. And we'll use that information and the risk exposure that I talked about in the model before as a way to try to create some tools, some scenarios, and do risk analysis to try to help us do a little bit better at managing risk. So the information security, so we have information systems, right? So we have hardware, operating systems, application software that need to work together to be able to achieve the purpose for which we use them in our organizations. So when we're talking about information systems, you remember from what I said before, your BTM courses, what this is about. And so there's a whole bunch of different things that we need to do. There's a whole bunch of different tasks or activities, business processes that we're going to be doing in large organizations to help us to protect the information that we need and the data that we need in order to take care of business, to do our job. So all organizations today have some kind of actor whose role in the organization is to manage information security. And of course, most large organizations have a computer information security officer, CISO, role, who's really the C-level executive who's going to be in charge of all of those. And then under that, there'll be a whole team of different people, different players that are going to have as a full-time job the duties of ensuring that the data and the systems are adequately protected. So that's the information system security that we're going to be using. Now, I do want to point out to you that this book that we're using, the documentation that we're using, comes from a U.S. source, and of course, our university is located in Canada and Quebec. And so we're going to talk about both because, really they all apply to us in the sense that modern businesses are working at a global scale. And so some of the things that are here, that are mentioned here, have more to do with the U.S. than with Canada, but they do apply to us in different ways. So there's all kinds of different regulations. In the U.S., GLBA has to do with managing financial data, similarly to Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Those have to do with large corporations or banks, how they manage financial information. And they apply to us because, most of the Canadian banks do operate at a global scale. So we basically have branches in the U.S. in many cases. Even a credit union like Desjardins has branches in Florida, for example, to serve our local citizens who spend a lot of time in Florida during the wintertime, so-called snowbirds. But other financial institutions like BMO or RBC, TD Bank have U.S. operations as well. And so then there's large Canadian corporations like Hydro-Quebec, the public utility here in Quebec, who gets financing on the U.S. markets, or other institutions who have some kind of trading or financing operations happening in the U.S. So by stocks or bonds or things like that. So they all would be subject to Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which is, again, a law that hopefully you learned about already in other business courses, but we'll perhaps talk a little bit about later on. Pci Dss has to do with credit card processing data. So all the banks, all the stores, all the vendors who deal with credit cards, who receive payments by credit cards, something that's going to concern them, different rules and regulation that apply to how personal identifying information, PII, is managed relating to credit card data, but also the financial information and the personal information of our customers have to be managed. HIPAA has to do with healthcare, so how healthcare data is managed. This HIPAA is the U.S. Law. So how financial information of American citizens is being managed electronically. But if, again, here for us in Canada, this does apply because we have insurance companies. We have data processing or outsourcing organizations that manage data for U.S. customers. So they have to follow these, and really all of the different laws that apply to specific sectors of the U.S. economy either are requirements here or we have a Canadian equivalent or a provincial equivalent to those obligations. So in Quebec, we have a Access to Information Act. We have some privacy laws for specific sectors, healthcare, education. We have laws for the protection of financial information. We have the Criminal Act. We have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedom that all have some kind of component that have to do with the privacy of citizens' data, but also that have some kind of requirements for security controls to be put in place by organizations. So these are all things that we need to keep in mind. I do want to point out that you see this little note here about Pci Dss. This is not a U.S. law, a federal law, or a Canadian law. This is actually from a consortium of credit card companies, companies that manage credit cards. So think of Visa, MasterCard kind of companies. There's 3 or 4 or 5 of those globally that have created this payment card industry association. And so they have rules in place that if you want to be able to process credit cards, which of course in today's globalized world with so much e-commerce happening, of course you want to be able to do that. If you want to do that, you got to follow their rules. As well, there's other elements that are not really mentioned here that are not really laws, but that are international treaties or international conventions. So in banking, there's something called the Bail 2, Bail 3. So from like this city Bail in Basel, in English, Bâle in French, in Switzerland, where these banking treaties were put in place, and they have to do with obligations that banks have because they have to be able to do clearing of checks and processing of checks between banks and overnight lending rates and things like that are regulated by this central authority. And so these are other obligations. So they're not laws, but they're international treaties. And if companies, or in this case banks, want to benefit from that, they need to follow those rules. We have international standards. So the International Standards Organization, ISO, for example, has some international standards for information security. The most famous one or most popular one is something called the ISO 27001, which is a sort of a continuous improvement, the PDCA, Deming Circle sort of management system approach. So the Information Security Management System, ISMS approach. So again, this is not a law, but this is something that many companies choose to follow because it gives them a sort of an international label of quality. And when they're talking to other players in the industry or to their customers or their suppliers, we can get a common vocabulary, a common understanding of what, how we define cybersecurity and what are sort of the requirements that we want to have in place, so we don't become a vulnerability for our suppliers or for our customers. So there's all these things that are important to us. There's a very vast landscape of laws and requirements that sometimes we choose to follow, or sometimes that we are legally obliged to comply with. And that's this idea here, this keyword in this slide, compliance, right? So you'll find in many large financial organizations, you're going to find a group of people whose job title says compliance. That's their job, is just to track this, to make sure that we are complying with all of our obligations. But as well, and that typically will be under the security, information security umbrella, or often part of corporate security, because of course many businesses are coming to the realization that information security is really one element of enterprise security and enterprise risk management. And so we can't, and cyber criminals, they don't really make a difference between, oh, this is information security, so let's try to hack this, and let's not try to get in through this other door. But they don't care. That's their business. Their job is to make money by being criminals. And so, by definition, they're not going to follow rules or laws. And so many organizations recognize that there's a lot of connections between the different elements of risk and from an enterprise point of view. And so, we're seeing that as enterprise risk management more and more. And information security is one of the components of that. So specifically, when we talk about information system security, we often will refer to the CIA, the three tenets of information security: CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So when we're talking about exposure to risk, we're often look at exposure to risk in relation to those three elements. So confidentiality has to do with the fact that we only want authorized users to view information that they're allowed to view. So that's the confidentiality aspect of it. So again, authorized users are authorized to access certain information. And so that's something that we want to protect, this level of confidentiality. Integrity. So we don't want people who aren't authorized to change information or information to somehow change. We want to maintain the integrity of the information because the information has value to us only if it's accurate. So we don't want the information to be changed without our knowledge or without our permission or in undue or mischievous way. And then finally, availability. So we need the information to be accessible when we need it, right? The information has value to me if it's not altered, so integrity. It has value to me if it's available when I need it. If it's not available to me when I need it, then it's really useless. So those three elements: confidentiality, integrity, availability. So confidentiality has to deal with private data of individuals. So information that you don't want to divulge, but that is necessary. So me as a business, there's certain information that I need. And so in order to provide the product or service that you want from me. And so I need to get this information, or maybe I'm legally obliged to have access to this information. If you want to get this service, like I think of a bank, for example, is going to need your social security number because the government requires us to have the social security number to try to prevent money laundering. It might be an example. Also, if you were getting, if I'm hiring you as an employee, I'm going to need your social security number because I need to give you, tax receipts at the end of the year for income tax purposes. In order to do that, I need your social security number. Or maybe you just want to apply for social security, and of course you need to give me your social security number if I'm the government, so I can see if you're eligible for these services and what services you're entitled to get. So that's the private data that sometimes I need to deal with. And so I have a legal obligation, right? Privacy laws, I have a legal obligation to protect this information. So for me, from an IT point of view, that's confidentiality that I have to maintain of this data. Some of the data may have some kind of intellectual property value to me. It might be copyrighted data. It might be industrial secrets, manufacturing secrets, information about how my products are made, or what gives my products a competitive advantage. That's IP, intellectual property. So that's something that also I'm going to want to keep confidential. I want to keep it, inside of the knowledge of this information inside of my organizations to people who are authorized to have access to this information. And then, of course, there could be some aspect that have to do with the national security or the protection of the citizens of a country and the operations of the country and the national interests of the country. So I could think of, there's something called SCADA. These are the the controls, the systems that control the electrical grid, the streets, the street lights, all of the different things, the water treatment facilities, water processing, circulation of water, drink water inside of a city. All of the systems that control that, they need to be protected, because if a threat had access to this, he could cause severe damage, right? If I'm going to bring down your country today, if I want to go at war with your country, probably the first thing that I should probably do is shut down the electricity and the water, and it won't take very long before your whole country turns to chaos. So, or maybe I could take remote control of hydroelectrical dams and just flood the plains of your country, and this would obviously cause significant chaos, right? So the information about that, or names of individuals, or names of people in my military, my police, my secret services, all of this information needs to be kept confidential, because it may impact the national interest of my country. So I'm going to put in some measures. Some of the measures that we really like to talk about are things like cryptography, so hiding data, encrypting data, really, so transforming data from text into cipher, so something that can be easily read. So I invite you to maybe over the weekend, if you haven't already, watch the Imitation Game movie. You'll get all the basics of cryptography and encryption that are there. And the cybertext, so the scrambled data that's coming out at the other end, that's probably your best bet to try to understand how that works. We can encrypt data to send it through the internet, so as a temporary measure, so using a virtual private network or a virtual tunnel that we create, that we dig through the internet. So from one point to the other point, the data is going to be encrypted, is going to be protected. That's a good example of how we could use cryptography as a way to in our daily lives, really, because maybe we're using that. You guys are probably using that already. Integrity. So we want to maintain the uncorrupted data, the accuracy of data. So we want to make sure the data is not altered. We want to make sure the data is valid. We want to make sure the data is accurate. And so when the users are connecting to the internet, so that's what integrity is about. Availability, making sure that the information is available when I need the information. So that brings us to trying to get some basic understanding of how this is actually all going to happen inside of an organization, in an organizational setting. So we're going to look at it. There's many ways that we could be looking at it, really, but I'm focusing on a strategy that is in line with what's being discussed in the course manual and in the book that is on which this course is based. So we're going to stick with sort of this way to represent the world that we have, the IT world of the organization, in 7 blocks, 7 domains. And so these are the 7 domains that we're going to be dealing with, that we're going to be talking about. So first we have the user domain, right? That is going to define the people. The workstation domain, so the computers. The LAN domain, so the networked devices. The LAN to WAN, so the local network connecting to the wide area network. The WAN domain, so the wide area network. The remote access, so people who are connecting from, perhaps working from home, who are connecting into it. And then the system domain, application domain, so all of the different mission critical systems that we have to deal with. So I'm not going into detail about what each of these are, because I'm hoping that at this point in your education, you already have had all kinds of different courses on that, and all of these concepts are very familiar to you. If not, maybe in the questions period after we can go more in depth if there's any of these that you want to know more about. So let's start with the user domain, right? So the people who access the organization's information systems. So in the user domain, we have roles and responsibilities. So we have users who need to access the system, and that's their job, right? So this is part of their job. And depending on what their role is in the organization and what are the tasks that they need to achieve, they have certain access rights. So we have a group of individuals who are going to do some kind of role-based access control, RBAC. And so depending on what is your role in the organization, this is going to give you certain access rights. And so we're going to want to put in place some mechanisms to adequately authentify the users so we can know that somebody is who they claim to be. And once we've authentified the users based on certain characteristics, maybe something that they know, like a password, user ID password, something that they have, perhaps some kind of token or access card or RFID device, or something that they are, so biometrics, fingerprints, retina scans, whatever. Used on these mechanisms, we're going to give you certain authorizations once we've authentified you. And then this is going to allow you access to certain things based on what has been defined that you should be doing. Users have responsibilities. Users are responsible for the IT assets that are allocated to them. So basically your computer that you're using, your phone, because your phone is a computer and it's an access device into your network in most organizations. Perhaps your home computer as well. You may have a laptop and you're traveling with this laptop. You're going to events, you're going to conferences, you're using airplanes, public transport, you're going home, you're using it from home. You're not the only person in your home. You have, other people who live with you, and so you're responsible because the corporation just can't always keep, track of where everything is. So, but of course, we want to trust as an organization. We want to trust, but we want to also put in place mechanisms to make sure that these equipments are adequately protected. But we'll talk about that later. And then there's accountability issues. So I talked about authorizations and authentication, but there's an accountability issue as well. We want to make sure. As a business, and particularly HR, we want to make sure that we have proper controls in place to ensure that we're not letting the wolf into the hen house, sort of say, right? So, I don't know, that's a weird expression these days, but so we don't want to get we don't want the fox to get access to the chicken, but we want to prevent the mischievous individuals to access the network. So because a big issue that we have, a big weakness, a big vulnerability that we have is people, relates to people. And so we want to make sure that we have in the user domain, we have certain controls in place. So like background checks or criminal checks and things like that are part of those components of the user domain. So some of the common threats that we have in the user domain, I guess probably the biggest one is the lack of user awareness. But really, we probably want to. We could also think of that one as the stupidity of users. Sad to say, but users aren't necessarily careful. Often don't necessarily care. What's the second one? Apathy. But our job as the cybersecurity department is going to be a big part of our job is going to be to make sure that the users are properly trained, and so that we have a very important component is a user awareness program. And so we're going to conduct security awareness training. We're going to display security awareness posters. We're going to insert reminders and banner greetings and send emails and newsletters and have all kinds of continuous education activities going on, yearly training, so getting them to sign certain documents on a yearly basis. So that's having a cybersecurity awareness program or sensitivity program in place in your organization. Another issue, so user apathy. So we want to conduct security awareness training. We want to have continuous audits, manuals. Everything needs to be updated on a regular basis. We want to make sure that we have, in order to prevent that we have certain programs. So, for example, we may have a part of an anti-phishing campaign where we actually send phishing emails internally to see if we're going to catch people. So we're going to do some kind of testing to make sure that people don't get lazy or don't display this apathy that we're talking about here. We have people who violate security policies for all kinds of reasons, sometimes really good reasons. At least they think they're good reasons. And so we have all these processes in place to allow people to derogate from or violate, voluntarily violate, or knowingly get permission to not follow a specific policy because of some kind of business reason. And this is really deadly. It's something that you want to try to avoid as much as possible. You can't really. Everyone's always going to have a good reason to try to violate the policy, right? It's always, yeah, but I'd say I'm a special situation and I have this and I have that and the VP is my cousin or whatever. But we want to make sure that we minimize those. And so we got to have in place some kind of process and tools in place to try to prevent that. USB keys, compact discs, DVD burners, all kinds of devices that can be used and that can be misused, that make it very, very easy for individuals, mischievous individuals or individuals who receive some kind of bribe, legitimate users who could be bribed using these devices and accessing personal data and giving it or selling it or doing something with it that they shouldn't be doing. Users who download stuff off the internet, pictures, music, videos, and those can actually be Trojan horses. Something can be hidden inside of it, like the famous horse that in the Trojan in the Greek mythology. And so people are downloading stuff that they shouldn't, and which creates a backdoor for hackers to get into your network. Users who are just deleting stuff or doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing. Disgruntled employees who attack an organization, who are somehow committing some form of sabotage. Big potential problem as well, because by the time you figure it out, it's too late. So you need to think about, data loss prevention mechanisms, backups, simple stuff that everyone knows about, but in the reality of everyday operations, you don't necessarily think about those. And then, of course, blackmail or extortion is always an interesting one. So the second domain we'll talk about, the next domain is the Workstation Domain. So in the Workstation Domain, we have, the configuration of the hardware and software, and want to make sure that we've hardened all of the configurations so that they're well protected. So the people in charge of that have certain roles and responsibilities in those regards, ensuring that the user workstations and the data are protected so that they can't be affected negatively. And so that's usually the responsibility of the director of IT security, who's usually in charge of protecting that. So you would typically have a team of individuals in the operations, IT operations, who are in charge of operating these workstations. And so they're going to work in collaboration with some other teams, something called the Red Team. The Red Team is your internal white hat hackers. So hackers that work for you, whose job it is to try to get into these workstations, try to hack your own network, which is perfectly legal. You're trying to hack yourself, right? So we call those the offensive security team, or commonly referred to as the red team. And so they're trying to hack into your network, and they're working in collaboration with the blue team. The blue team is defensive security. And so the blue team people, they're going to they're going to try to figure out all the potential vulnerabilities that could affect the workstations. And so their job, when the red team identifies some issues, the blue team is going to look at, okay, how can we protect from that? And then they'll be sending the information to the exploitation or the operations group, who's going to adapt the configuration files and the hardware to make sure that we're going to be protected from that. So some of the common threats that we have to deal with: the unauthorized user access, so people who can get into your workstation because of poor misused passwords or poorly chosen passwords, or even backdoors into different systems. Unauthorized access to systems and data, so we need to have access control policy, standards, procedures, guidelines, so that we could have something in place to prevent that. But also we want to have ongoing testing going on to make sure that this is that legitimate users are accessing the system and that systems are being used properly. That's going to be one of the roles of the red team that I spoke about before. We have desktop and laptop systems, operating systems that have weaknesses, that have vulnerabilities. Shouldn't be no secret to you. Every Tuesday or every regularly, there's patches that have to be loaded on your system to protect them. That's because weaknesses, vulnerabilities have been identified, and now we want to block these vulnerabilities from being exploited by potential threats or hazards. And so that's why we do patches every once in a while. But putting a patch onto an operating system can create some other problems, maybe incompatibility of different software that you're using or applications. So you can't just start loading patches in a corporate environment. So there's got to be a system, there's got to be something in place to try to manage all of that. That's actually going to be a fair amount of work needs to go behind the scenes to make sure that this happens in a smooth fashion. Also, and perhaps something we'll talk about later on in the semester, but in another class. But there's also there's people whose job it is to try to identify these vulnerabilities, these bugs, and who sometimes might sell the information on the dark web so hackers can use this information. Or but some companies have bug bounty programs, so that they pay people who find bugs about their systems. They'll give them some kind of reward, a bounty, and then they'll make sure that they can patch it very, very quickly before they've actually become known to the public. But again, we'll talk about that more later. Of course, viruses and malware of different kinds, malicious code, Trojan horses, etc. There's all potential problem. User that are just plugging a USB key. If the USB ports haven't been disabled on your work computers, and just plug in a USB key. We have many famous data thefts that have occurred because of somebody just plugging in a USB key and downloading all the data during his break or whatever. I mean, you have a 128 gig USB key can contain a heck of a lot of data. And then, of course, I talked about people downloading pictures and stuff. So now we'll move on to the next one, which is the LAN domain. So in the LAN domain, so we have the physical network components, the logical configuration of services for users, right? So all of the LAN components, the local area network, so the machines inside of your own organization, one physical geographic location that are all connected together. And so there's a lot of doors that are being created because of that. Because if I get into one machine on the LAN, then I can get onto the whole LAN potentially. So there's a lot of things that have to be managed into physical network components, so switches, routers, all of these different devices, or Wi-Fi access controls, access systems that need to be managed and controlled. So that's the land manager's department who's going to be in charge of that, and who want to, make sure that only legitimate users can access your network, but also that the data that is circulating on your network is not being spied on, right? Maintain the confidentiality, and that the data is not being altered, so the integrity of the data as well. So common threats that we have here, unauthorized physical access to the land, perhaps somebody coming into the building, or if you have a wireless network going very close to the building and being able to gain access into the local area network without appropriate authorization. Because perhaps maybe, it's always a combination, right? Perhaps there's the fact that, there's a user who's used a weak password, and so I can connect somehow to your LAN, and then I could try common names, or if I have some idea of what usernames look like in your organization, and I can find a user who has a weak password, or maybe just a user who uses the same password for everything, and so somehow I was able to figure out, maybe through buying it on the dark web, a user's Facebook password, and that user uses the same password for everything. So his Facebook password is also his office network password. So anyway, using these kind of techniques, it's really not that hard. Or in some cases, just social engineering. I just call somebody up, say, "Hey, I'm Mark from tech support. I'm trying to fix your computer. I'm not able to log in. Can you help me out?" And say, "Yeah, sure, no problem." So can you try to type in your password? I'm going to check on the console, see if I can see you log in. I said, "No, it's not working." No, maybe I'll try from here. So what's your name? What's your username? Oh, okay, yeah. What's your password? And, a lot of people will just tell you. It's surprising how easy it is. Yeah, you can just Google it. You'll see there's all kind of videos, and even when we do like hackathons and capture the flag events, hacker events, there'll be competitions to see how somebody can do it, and somebody who's really good at it can who's really sounds believable. It really won't take long. You can get into pretty much any company within 5, 10, 15 minutes when you really try. So that's the kind of things that we're talking about here. There's weaknesses, of course, in the network equipment. So the servers, the operating systems, the different software that they use, database softwares or whatever. So there's all kinds of these different issues that sometimes servers aren't configured exactly the way that they should, or they didn't follow the best practices for configuration. So all of these things are creating weaknesses. So the next domain, so we have the local area network, and we'll talk about the wide area network after this. But between the two, there's the LAN to WAN. So this basically the routers and the firewall that are connecting. So this is really the physical door, and so making sure that these appliances, these devices, are security devices, are well maintained, that they're well segregated from the rest of the network, that they're well configured, that we have rules in place, like logical rules, firewall rules, that control how the information is circulating between the local and the wide area network. We'll talk later on, and you'll see in some of the videos I've put, I think it's next week's class, I've added some links also to some videos on YouTube where you can go look at things like the zero trust architecture, or how we design these. And we'll talk about that a bit more. But there's a lot of potential threats there, because this is really the wall that is separating the good from the bad, I guess we could say. But the wall separating the U.S. to Mexico, it's not certainly far from being perfect, and it creates perhaps a whole bunch of other problems as well. It's really the same thing, kind of issues that we're going to have to deal with here. But we do want to make sure that this is properly configured, so that we're at least making it harder for hackers or for potential threats to take advantage or exploit weaknesses there. Preventing probing and port scanning, something that we're going to do in some of the labs. preventing unauthorized access, making sure that all the devices are properly configured and they don't have any potential bugs or weaknesses or vulnerabilities that are known and that can easily be exploited. Perhaps blocking at that level certain types of file attachments that potentially could contain some kind of Trojanly hidden mischievous thing component inside of it. Then the WAN domain, so the wide area network, where we're going to have, everyone is going to be there. This is the wide area network, so we have people geographically very, very diverse. We have all kinds of different laws that are there. So again, here there's some physical components that need to be properly configured, and we're gonna need to make sure that these are properly managed. So again, something we'll talk about more later. Easy access, sometimes legitimate access, like your website needs to be accessed by people from outside the organization. But at the same time, we want to make sure that it's properly operating as well. There's things like denial of service or distributed denial of service attacks that, your equipment is properly configured and it's working and it's doing what it should be doing. But, it's just having to deal with so much traffic because somebody is sending traffic to it purposefully to try to make it unusable to you. And then, of course, we're dealing with internet protocols, so there's all kinds of issues there as well. There's all kinds of traffic going on. There's other types of protocols like simple network management protocols and other types of protocols that have all kinds of weaknesses because, as we'll talk about in a few weeks, these have never really been designed for security. Security was really an afterthought in many of them. So a lot of things there also that we're going to want to think about and worry about. And then we have another domain, which is the remote access domain. So, we have mobile users that are connecting through the public internet. We've certainly seen that a lot recently with everything that's going on in the world. So we also need to make sure that we have mechanisms in place to protect that and have adequate levels of protection for that and updates for that, because many of those require some kind of simple authentication mechanisms that are really very old, user ID and passwords. There's all kinds of ways that those can be broken into, and there's all kinds of ways that this can be misused and so data could be leaked through the remote access domain. So again, something we'll talk about more. And then finally, the system application domain, so the hardware and the design of the hardware and the servers and the operating systems and the database software and all the different softwares that are there. And so we need to make sure that security policies and standards and procedures are in place. So, all kinds of threats. Again, here, stuff we'll talk about in the next few weeks, but unauthorized access to data centers, physical access we're talking about, and computer rooms and wiring closets, but also logical access to information as well. So those are the domains. So one important thing to keep in mind is that, security is like this big chain, and it's the weakest link that's going to break, and that's we're just as safe as the weakest link that we have in our security. And so typically the easiest one, the weakest one is going to be the user, the human factor. So there's, different things that we can do to try to limit that. Training, personally, because of what I do professionally, training is the big one for me, awareness programs and training of users. But definitely it starts by background checks, right? We want to make sure that we look at, individuals. We don't want to let people in our company who have criminal histories. We maybe, depending on the type of business you're in, you probably want to look at their credit ratings as well, because people with a bad credit rating can probably be more easily subdued or corrupted. And then, so these are the kind of things that background checks are going to do. We're going to also want to review those on a regular basis. We're going to make sure that we segregate duties, that people don't have access to everything, but also that it's not always the same person has access to everything, because then it gets a lot easier. And we'll talk about some real world examples of that perhaps in the question period that we're going to have online in Zoom, because there's some things that, I have certainly a lot of personal experience in some of these things, but don't necessarily want to put them here on YouTube. So perhaps some things that we can discuss more privately, although, I'm legally, contractually obliged not to reveal any private information or delicate, sensitive information about my employer or my customers. But still, there's a lot of, very well-known cases of things that have happened that we can talk about. So then we want to put in place some testing. So we want to have different test mechanisms in place to ensure that we challenge the users, and we perhaps do something so that we can see if they evaluate their honesty or their level of awareness or their level of how much they care about security, level of apathy, I guess you could say. And of course, we want to do audits. Both internal and external audits are absolutely critical. Some of the key components of dealing with users have to do with certain best practices that we want to put in place, certain mechanisms that we want to put in place, but also internal controls that are critical, and of course, audit that are critical. So it's the combination of multiple things that make this work. So, and one of the first things that you need to do if you're coming into an organization, and if it doesn't have an IT security policy, the first thing you want to do is have a security policy. And the security policy, to be functional, has to be legible and understandable by users. So it needs to be a relatively short document. 2, 3, maybe. If it's more than like 10 pages, it's probably too big. Right? It should be simple, something simple that says what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. It's got to provide some definitions of how stuff is supposed to be used. It's got to have some instructions on how to use the different policies, because really it's going to be a part of a hierarchy. So you're going to have a high-level policy, which is going to be backed up by standards, internal procedures, and internal guidelines. So really, at a high level, you're going to have a main policy, and then you're going to have some other policies for specific areas, which then, in their application inside of the organization, you're going to have standards, procedures, and guidelines that are going to be provide more detail on how this policy is actually going to be put in place within the organization. So some of the typical ones that you're going to find: security awareness policy, acceptable use policy, asset classification, so how we classify data and assets in the organization, how we manage assets, how we assess vulnerabilities and how we manage vulnerabilities, and how we assess threats and how we monitor threats. These are not the only ones, but these are the basic ones that you absolutely should be starting with. So when I talked about classification of data, when we talked about confidentiality of data, but in reality, how this is actually measured is going to be on a scale that goes at the lowest level from public information to the highest level of private data. The actual labels inside the organization might be a little bit different, but public data is stuff that you can just, it doesn't matter. Anyone can know this information. It's probably or could be on your website. Internal use is information that you just need inside to use for the organization that really shouldn't be shared with the public, but it's not necessarily highly strategic information. More strategic information would, at the very minimum, be confidential, and sometimes we'll even have something called secret to break down confidentiality into maybe 1 or 2 levels. But if it's information that is about the organization and that could provide some kind of strategic value, that would have some kind of strategic value, intellectual property or industrial secrets, at the very minimum, this should be confidential information. And then if it's private information of individuals within the organization that allow you to identify specific individuals, things like social security numbers, their salary, their home address, either of your employees or your customers or stakeholders of the organization, privately identifiable information, PII, this would be something called private data. Now, privacy is not the same thing as confidentiality. Hopefully you guys understand the difference between the two. Privacy has to do with the private information of an individual. Confidentiality is because it has some kind of strategic connection to it. So private information could be confidential. Confidential information is not necessarily private. So an important distinction that you need to keep in mind. So just come back to what we talked about, right? So remember, keep in mind the concepts, the basic concepts of information security, what security is, what risk is. Security being the absence of unacceptable risks. So unacceptability could be very subjective. Absence could be very subjective. Risk is the combination of three things, right? For risk, you need hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. Or if you prefer, threat, vulnerability, and impact. So there's got to be something potentially that can take advantage of a weakness, and the result of that has to be some kind of negative impact of the organization. That's your exposure to that potential impact. That's what we're going to use to evaluate risk or to prioritize different things that could need some kind of treatment. When we're talking about the value of information in cybersecurity, we think about the CIA. So we look at the confidentiality, the integrity, the availability. These are not the only things that we need to think about, but those are the three big ones that we're always going to be keeping, in the front of our mind, to trying to remember. Okay, what are the confidentiality issues here? What are the integrity issues? What are the availability issues? That's the sort of the bare minimum that we're going to need to think about in thinking about security. We're going to look at 7 domains, and we'll talk more about that in the upcoming weeks. But, from the local level, from the machine, from the user, from the LAN, the WAN, the connection between the two, the wide area network, the remote machines, the software, the applications, the systems. So those are how we're going to sort of break down the infrastructure. So the whole, IT setup that we have to deal with in our organization. We're always going to try to identify the weakest link, because the weakest link is the most potentially problematic area. So we're going to do something about that. And the first thing we want to make sure that we have in place is a security policy framework, making sure that we have, a good, potentially usable, workable IT security policy, and also that when we're talking about our data, that we understand how the data is going to be classified in the organization. So that's the end of this lecture. We'll hopefully see you again next week for lecture 2.